Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. At the end of October 2019, after too many months of piling up overtime hours at my marketing job in Boston, I made the decision to rent a small log cabin near Stowe, Vermont. I longed to breathe air scented with pine instead of car exhaust, and to enjoy nights so silent that I could hear my own thoughts. The cabin was located on a gravel road called Tucker Lane, about 4 miles from town, surrounded by sugar maples blazing in shades of red and orange. The host, Janice Evans, had told me by message that the closest neighbor lived about 50 meters away, hidden among the trees. She was clearly proud of the privacy the place offered, and I appreciated it. I left Boston before sunrise on Monday, October 27th, and drove up Interstate 93 until the mountains began to rise on both sides of the highway. Around 10 a.m., I reached Stowe, stopped at the Shaw's Supermarket on Mountain Road to buy groceries, and then continued north on Route 100. A small crooked wooden sign announced the entrance to Tucker Lane. The pavement disappeared after a quarter mile, and my rental car began to bounce over the uneven gravel. The cabin appeared on the left like something from a postcard. Freshly cut log walls, a green metal roof, and smoke rising from the chimney. Through the bare branches, I could make out another house farther up the hill, a 2-story farmhouse, sun-bleached, its windows dark. I assumed that was the neighbor Janice had mentioned. A small lockbox held the key. When I entered, the interior smelled of cedar and old wood smoke. The main room had a sofa, a stone fireplace, and a small open kitchen. A narrow hallway led to the bedroom with a double bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out toward the farmhouse. A sliding glass door opened to a balcony over a shallow stream. I dropped my things, lit a fire with the stacked birch logs, and sent Janice a quick message to let her know I had arrived safely. She replied with a smiling emoji and reminded me to lock the back door at night since black bears sometimes wandered around sniffing. The rest of that first day I spent on small tasks I normally rush through at home, sweeping fallen leaves off the porch, organizing the few groceries in the fridge, and brewing coffee just to fill the place with its smell. By late afternoon, the sun was sinking behind Mount Mansfield, and the air had turned sharp and cold. I put on a jacket and stepped outside to watch the sky change. That was when I met him. He walked along the tree line that separated the two properties. A man in his 60s, cheeks reddened by the cold gray hair flattened under a worn Vermont catamounts cap. He carried a silver thermos in his hand and lifted his arm in greeting as soon as he saw me. I waved back, expecting him to keep walking, but instead he turned toward my porch. "Good evening," he said, stopping at the foot of the steps. His voice carried that soft Vermont accent, the R's sliding gently into the next word. Thought I'd introduce myself. "I'm Harold Jensen, owner of the old White House next door." I gave him my name and explained that I was just renting for a week. He chuckled softly, saying I had chosen a good time of year to find peace and quiet. We chatted for about 10 minutes about the fall foliage, early frosts, and the best spot in town to buy apple cider donuts. He kept a polite distance, hugging the thermos with both hands as if for warmth. Before leaving, he tipped his cap and mentioned that he liked to take a walk every evening around 5 to stretch his legs. If he saw me outside, he'd be glad for the company. I told him that sounded nice and wished him good night. When he disappeared into the pines, I thought it was almost storybook-like, meeting a friendly neighbor in such a secluded place. The next morning, the cabin windows were fogged with heat from the wood stove. I cooked bacon and eggs and spent hours on the balcony reading a novel I'd been putting off for months. The only sounds were the cawing of crows, the steady murmur of the stream, and the occasional distant hum of a car on Route 100. Around 4 p.m., I decided to walk a short stretch of the Catamount Trail. I enjoyed the crunch of leaves under my boots. When I returned, dusk was already creeping through the woods, so I turned on the porch light, and as if on cue, Harold appeared from the shadows. This time he stopped closer to the steps, wearing the same cap and a heavy canvas coat. "Hope you found the trail all right," he said kindly. His eyes were pale blue, the kind that grow watery with age. I assured him I had and asked how long he'd lived in the area. "All my life," he replied. "My family bought this land before the war. The Second World War, of course. Things were quieter back then." He smiled as if brushing off the weight of his words. We talked a bit about Boston, about his love for Boston college hockey, and he even joked that I probably hated the Bruins' rivals. I noticed his hands trembled slightly each time he raised the thermos to his lips. After about 15 minutes of conversation, he said he didn't want to keep me from dinner. Once again, he tipped his cap and walked back to his farmhouse. I watched him climb the porch, open a side door, and disappear inside. A light flickered briefly behind a curtain, then went dark. That night I slept peacefully, no strange dreams, only the steady lull of the stream outside my window. Wednesday dawned gray with scattered drizzle. I went into town, browsed a few shops on Main Street, and had lunch at Butler's Pantry. Back at the cabin, I lit a stronger fire and listened to the wind push the rain against the roof. Around 5:30, there was a soft knock at the door. Harold was on the porch, his coat speckled with raindrops. "Thought I'd check to make sure you weren't drowning out here all alone," he joked with a light laugh. I invited him in, but he shook his head. He didn't want to muddy the floor with his boots. We talked from opposite sides of the doorway for about 10 minutes. He asked what book I was reading, and I held it up through the screen door. He squinted, smiled, and said he had read it back in college. Then I realized that must have been in the late 70s, which matched the age he seemed to be. Before leaving, he rested his hand briefly on the doorframe and warned me to be careful if I went out at night. Sometimes coyotes followed the course of the stream. Then he vanished into the rain, leaving only wet footprints on the porch. Thursday arrived shrouded in thick fog. It was Halloween, though tourist season was nearly over. I cooked oatmeal, answered a single work email out of obligation, and spent the rest of the day idling. The silence grew heavier and heavier, until it felt like I could hear the hum of my own nerves. In a way, I was thankful Harold would likely appear at dusk to break that overwhelming calm. But he came earlier than usual, around 4:30. He wore an old wool sweater that looked hand-knit. He greeted me, climbed the porch steps, and leaned on the railing. We talked about trivial things: a black bear spotted near Smuggler's Notch, the high school football season, and whether the first snow would come before Thanksgiving. At one point I asked, "Do they rent this cabin often to people like me?" He shrugged. "Not many since what happened over there." He nodded toward his farmhouse. I looked at him, waiting for an explanation, but he just stared at the pines. I pressed him again, asking what he meant. He opened his mouth, hesitated, and finally smiled as though choosing an easier answer. "Ah, just insurance problems after a storm caused damage. We boarded things up, and I guess it puts people off." Something inside me recalled how those windows looked dark and dusty, even though 2 nights before I had seen a light flick on. Maybe he only used part of the house. It wasn't my business. By then, the sun was already slipping behind the mountain and shadows covered the clearing. Harold said he needed to check on his generator before the rain returned, waved goodbye, and walked off. I locked the door behind him and stood there for a moment, unsettled without knowing why. Suddenly, the cabin felt too silent. To distract myself, I showered, cooked pasta, and watched steam rise in the cold air outside the window. Around 8 p.m., I poured a glass of water and opened my laptop to write a quick midweek review for Janice, just as a courtesy. I wrote that everything was perfect and added almost without thinking that her neighbor Harold had been very kind every evening. The typing indicator appeared on the screen. Then it stopped. It flickered again. Finally, her reply came, short. "What neighbor?" Confused, I answered right away. "Harold Jensen, an older man who lives in the white farmhouse next door." This time, the typing dots lingered longer. When the reply came, it froze me. "I don't know anyone named Harold. That house has been empty since the owner, Arthur Jensen, disappeared in 2016. It's been boarded up ever since." A slow chill spread down my back. It wasn't sudden fear, but that deep unease when something ordinary no longer makes sense. I typed, I've been talking to him every evening. He told me he lives there. Janice replied immediately, "Nobody lives there. If you want, I'll call the sheriff." My first thought was that she must be mistaken, or maybe I had misheard the name. But Jensen wasn't exactly common, and the farmhouse did look abandoned, time-worn, and dusty. I walked to the bedroom window and pulled back the curtain. In the moonlight, the old house was visible through the branches. All the first-floor windows were crudely boarded up. There was no sign of that porch light I'd seen before. I don't know how long I stood there, long enough for my breath to fog the glass. I imagined Harold walking again through the trees, thermos in hand, watching my cabin from the shadows. My rational side insisted it was a misunderstanding, but my heartbeat was too fast to reason. I thanked Janice for the warning and told her I'd be fine. She urged me to lock all doors and call her if I noticed anything strange. I shut down the laptop, stoked the fire until the flames cast restless shadows on the walls, and tried to sleep. That night, sleep was hard to come by. Every crackle from the logs in the fireplace jolted my eyes open. Sometime deep into the night, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, I heard what sounded like the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves right outside the front door. They were slow, hesitant steps. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The porch didn't creak, no one tried the doorknob, but the silence left behind was heavier than any noise. I glanced at my phone, 3:12 a.m. I stayed awake, eyes wide, until the first pale light of dawn filtered through the curtains. Friday morning, I tried to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe Harold was some caretaker Janice didn't know about. Or perhaps someone was squatting in the farmhouse without permission but was harmless. I brewed coffee, drank it too fast, and burned my tongue. Then I decided to walk into town to clear my head. I followed the gravel road down toward Route 100. Halfway down the slope, I crossed a clearing and noticed fresh footprints in the damp soil, larger and wider than mine, leading toward the boarded-up farmhouse. The edges were sharp. Someone had passed through recently. My heart raced as I kept walking. When I reached the highway, I thought of turning right toward the village center. Instead, I crossed the road and went straight to the Stowe Police Department. The brick building sat behind the town hall and looked more like a library than a station. Inside, an officer at the desk listened calmly as I told him everything. His badge read G. Perrin. He asked basic questions: height, hair color, any distinctive features. I mentioned the Vermont Catamounts cap and the silver thermos. He nodded and said they'd checked the area. He also warned me not to confront anyone on my own. He took down my phone number and promised to call if they found anything. I thanked him, bought a sandwich at the Green Goddess Cafe, and returned to the cabin. The afternoon dragged on endlessly. I tried to read but kept losing my place. Loose boards banged in the wind somewhere, and every noise made me flinch. By evening, storm clouds had gathered over the mountains, staining the sky a dark, wet gray. For a moment, I thought Harold might appear again from the pines, but the clearing stayed empty. I wasn't sure if that was more comforting or more unsettling. At 7 p.m., heavy slanted rain began to fall. I turned on every lamp in the cabin as if light itself could ward off fear. While heating soup on the stove, I heard a thump outside, then another, slower, like someone testing each step of the porch. I turned off the burner and held my breath. The window by the door reflected only my frightened face against the darkness outside. Then a voice came through, muffled by the storm, but clear enough. "Good evening. Sorry to come so late." My throat tightened. It was Harold's voice, but something in the tone had changed. It no longer sounded warm, but urgent. "Could use a little shelter." "Power went out on my side," he said. Every instinct screamed not to open the door. Trying to sound calm, I answered, "I already called the police for you." The silence that followed was suffocating. Rain hammered the roof, and for nearly half a minute there was nothing else. I imagined his silhouette just inches from the door, maybe surprised, maybe angry. Finally, he spoke again, softer this time, almost pleading. "I'm just your neighbor, friend. No need for police. Sometimes the loneliness gets heavy. You said we could chat." I didn't reply. Another eternal minute passed. Then I heard a single heavy step on the lower stair, followed by retreating footsteps, squelching through the mud, fading back toward the farmhouse. I stood frozen until the smell of burning soup snapped me out of it. I dumped the pot in the sink, grabbed my phone, and dialed Officer Perrin directly. He said a patrol was already on the way to check the property and would arrive in about 20 minutes. He told me not to go outside, to lock everything, and to avoid contact. I thanked him and hung up. A lightning flash lit every window like stage lights, then plunged the room into darkness again. In that instant, I saw a figure standing motionless among the trees, halfway between the cabin and the boarded-up house. The next flash showed only emptiness. My pulse pounded so hard I felt it in my ears. Finally, a little after 9 p.m., I saw red and blue lights moving down Tucker Lane. 2 patrol cars stopped on the grassy shoulder beside the old farmhouse. The officers shone flashlights across the porch, the door, and the weathered walls. I watched from my window as they circled the building. One officer climbed the porch, tested the side door, and eventually forced it open. Several minutes passed before they came out again, shaking their heads. One of them pointed his flashlight at the muddy ground, following tracks that disappeared into the thick undergrowth. After about 15 minutes, Officer Perrin approached my cabin. I let him in. His coat dripped puddles onto the mat. "We found evidence that someone's been inside," he said. "Food wrappers, a sleeping bag, some personal items. But no one is there now." What chilled me was his next sentence. "The thermos you mentioned was on the kitchen counter." I asked if the name Harold Jensen meant anything to him. He checked his notes and replied, "Arthur Jensen bought that property in '86. He was reported missing in December 2016. No close family." He cleared his throat and added, "We'll keep looking. Could be someone using the house illegally, a drifter pretending to be the owner." I nearly told him that Harold had claimed he'd lived there all his life, that he knew local history, sports teams, even town gossip. But the words sounded so unreal in my head that I couldn't bring myself to say them aloud. Perrin advised me to leave the area that very night if possible. Within 10 minutes, my bag was packed haphazardly, clothes stuffed in without order. I drove toward town while the patrol cars escorted me as far as the Trapp family lodge, where Janice had reserved me a room. That night's sleep was fitful. I woke over and over, imagining wet footprints on the floor or the metallic gleam of that battered thermos. By dawn, the storm had passed. The clouds hung low, and the mountains looked bruised purple in the morning light. I left early, grabbed coffee, and drove back toward Boston. Near Waterbury, my phone regained signal, and a voicemail appeared from Officer Perrin. His tone was serious, heavier than the night before. They had found more evidence upstairs in the farmhouse, family photographs of Arthur Jensen. Among them, one image matched the man I had spoken to. The photo was dated 1998. They had also discovered a death certificate, Arthur Harold Jensen, born 1956, declared deceased January 2017. The officer ended by saying they would continue investigating the case as a possible intrusion, but there were no signs of anyone currently occupying the property. He suggested I contact them if I remembered any further details. That same afternoon, back in Boston, I opened the photo I had taken of the farmhouse on my first day. Zooming in, I noticed a metallic glint in one of the upstairs windows, a faint cylindrical reflection. The quality was poor, it could have been anything, but in my mind there was no doubt. It looked like the shine of a dented thermos. Weeks passed and routine returned, deadlines, subway noise, neon lights outside my apartment. But sometimes when there's a blackout in the city and the room falls into darkness for just an instant, I hear again that soft voice by the door, asking to come in, insisting he was simply alone. Story 2. This happened to me when I was in college. I was 21 in early June 2021, fresh out of final exams at Western Washington University in Bellingham, exhausted after 3 straight nights without sleep. My roommates were each leaving for their own summer plans, but I still had 2 free weeks before returning to my part-time job at the library. All I wanted was silence. Silence so deep I could hear my own breathing. So I booked a small cedar cabin through Airbnb. The listing said it was on a 5-acre wooded property at the end of Lost River Road near Mazama, a tiny town in northern Washington just a few miles from the Canadian border. The photos showed a one-room cabin with a wide front porch, an iron stove, and large windows facing the firs. It looked perfect. I left Bellingham on a gray Monday, drove Highway 20 east through Cedro Woolley, and climbed toward Rainy Pass. Snow still lingered on the road's edges, but the sky cleared as I descended into the Methau Valley. I lost cell service after Winthrop. The road narrowed more and more, reduced to cracked asphalt winding between towering Douglas firs. A hand-painted sign reading Riversong Cabins marked a gravel turnoff. My little Honda rattled for half a mile until the trees opened into a clearing. There was the cabin, freshly varnished cedar, green metal roof, and a porch swing facing the woods. I met the host, Mary, a retired teacher who lived in a larger house among the trees. She handed me an actual metal key, no codes. "There's no Wi-Fi here," she said with a smile. "If you need anything, call the landline." Cell towers don't reach past Winthrop. I told her that was exactly what I wanted, thanked her, and dragged my bag inside. That first night felt like the start of a retreat. I brewed coffee on a little propane stove, sat on the porch swing, and listened to the Methau River roaring somewhere below the hill. The air smelled of pine resin and distant rain. Around 10, I lit the wood stove, read a few pages by lantern light, and fell asleep to the gentle ticking of cooling iron. The next morning, I woke to something odd. In front of the window, on the moss-covered ground barely a yard from the porch, was a small pile of stones. Each rock was about the size of an egg, stacked into a cone about 8 inches high. I thought maybe a squirrel or raccoon had played with the rocks from the path, but the pile was too neatly arranged. I went outside, nudged it with my foot, and the tower collapsed. Shrugging, I made oatmeal and spent the day hiking a stretch of the Pacific Crest Trail near Cutthroat Pass. I saw maybe 10 people the whole way. That night, the stillness was heavier than before. No wind, no river noise, just absolute silence pressing against the cabin walls. Lying in bed, I caught myself straining to hear something, anything. Eventually, the crickets started their song again, and I managed to sleep. At dawn, the floorboards glowed with morning light. When I turned toward the window, my stomach clenched. Another stone pile identical to the first, in the same spot, just as carefully arranged. A chill ran down my neck. Maybe Mary's grandchildren were playing a prank, but she told me they lived in Wenatchee. I went out, snapped a photo with my phone, though I had no service, and kicked the tower down harder than I needed to. That day I went kayaking on a calm stretch of the Methau near Carleton. The water soothed me, but on the drive back along Lost River Road at dusk, an irrational dread told me not to return. Still, I had no choice. The cabin waited in silence, dark and still. I lit the lantern early, pulled the curtains across the big windows, and tried to read. Every 15 minutes I peeked outside, only dark trunks and the faint outline of the railing. Near midnight, I convinced myself I was overreacting, got under the quilt and closed my eyes. A noise woke me, wood creaking under weight. The porch swing often swayed in the wind, but this was heavier. A single step that groaned through the board. I held my breath until my chest ached. The cabin had no bedroom lock. It was just one room. The only thing separating me from whatever was outside was the front door's handle. Silence returned, thick, until I heard a faint scraping. Stone against wood, I thought. Then nothing more. Minutes stretched into eternity. Finally, gray light seeped around the curtain edges. Forcing myself, heart hammering, I pulled the fabric aside. A third stone pile now sat on the porch railing, perfectly centered, directly across from the window where I'd laid my head. I staggered back, nauseous. That pile hadn't been there at midnight. Someone had built it while I slept less than 6 feet away, with only glass between us. I yanked the curtain shut, threw clothes into my bag, and jammed my boots on, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the keys twice. Outside, the air was cold and damp. I scanned the trees, bracing for someone to step out. Nothing moved. I thought about leaving right then, but anger rose above fear. I marched across the clearing to Mary's house. She answered in a robe, startled by my expression. I blurted everything: the stone piles, the porch creak, the strange scraping. To her credit, she didn't dismiss me. She brewed coffee and called the Okanogan County Sheriff's Office. About an hour later, a deputy arrived. Ramirez, mid-30s, calm voice that eased me. He checked the cabin's perimeter, crouched under the porch, and showed me flattened grass. Shining his flashlight underneath, he muttered, "Someone's been crawling around down here." He lay on his stomach, slid halfway under, and came back out with a dirty sleeping bag, a crumpled protein bar wrapper, and a cheap flashlight with no batteries. "This isn't yours, right?" he asked. I shook my head hard. He took photos and led me a few yards into the woods behind the cabin. A narrow trail I hadn't noticed snaked deeper into the forest. Fresh prints marked the ground, softened only by rain. About 50 feet in, the trail opened to a clearing the size of a living room. In the center stood another stone pile, taller, nearly 2 feet high. Next to it leaned an old military backpack against a tree. Ramirez prodded it open with a pen. Inside were men's thermal clothes, cans of beans, a hunting knife in a torn leather sheath, and a spiral notebook. Many pages were ripped out. On the one remaining, lines of tally marks covered the paper, along with the phrase "night visitor" written again and again. My knees trembled. The deputy called for backup to search the area and walked me back to the cabin. "Pack your things," he said gently. "I'll escort you to the road." While I stuffed my belongings into the car, Ramirez paused on the porch to examine the windows. "Notice anything else last night?" he asked. "No, just the porch creak. Maybe the swing." He pointed at the chains still, but another detail froze me. Faint prints of 2 hands on the glass, as if someone had leaned in to look inside. I followed the patrol car to the paved road, my pulse spiking every time a shadow crossed the headlights. At the asphalt, he signaled me to continue, then turned back to the cabin. I drove straight to a motel in Wenatchee, locked myself in a second-floor room, and kept the lamp on all night. That afternoon, Ramirez called. Detectives and a tracking dog had swept the area but found no trace of the man. The trail ended at a service road. He'd been sleeping under that porch for at least a week, Ramirez said. Probably watching guests, waiting for someone alone, gathering courage each night to get closer. I asked about fingerprints, the notebook. Anything to identify him. Nothing matched. "We'll keep the evidence," he said. "Mary will install motion lights and cameras, but I wouldn't recommend you go back there." From the motel lobby, I emailed Airbnb. They offered a refund and a generic apology. That night, before heading back down the highway, I scrolled through the photos I'd taken on the first day. The cabin, the river, the sunset between pines. In one shot, captured at dusk from the porch, I noticed something I'd missed. Between 2 trunks in the background, a pale oval shape. I zoomed in until the pixels warped. It was a face. No features clear in the darkness, but undeniably human. Watching from the trees while I smiled, oblivious at the camera. Nausea churned in my stomach. That meant he'd been there from the first night. The stone piles weren't warnings. They were markers of how far he'd dared to come. By the 3rd night, they touched the cabin. And so did he. I drove Highway 2, checking the rearview mirror over and over, even in daylight across the Cascades. Back home in Bellingham, I spent a week sleeping on friends' couches, too nervous to be alone. It's been 4 years, and I still refuse to rent places where the hosts boast about isolation. Now I need neighbors, streetlights, the faint hum of traffic, any sign of constant human presence. Some people find peace in silence. I learned that silence can hide someone already far too close. With time, I've replayed every detail. The first stone pile must have taken him minutes to build, right by my bed, confident I wouldn't wake. The second proved he came back after I knocked it down. The third confirmed his growing confidence, placing it against the window. What would have happened the 4th night? The deputy said maybe he'd have tried the door, maybe just a scare. I don't share that optimism. The knife in the backpack suggests something darker. I asked Ramirez if they ever found him. He said no, but suspected a drifter who wanders the national forests every summer, living unseen. The notebook and backpack stayed as evidence, but with no name, the case went cold. Sometimes I imagine hikers stumbling on an abandoned campsite and finding those words, "Night visitor" carved into bark, or stones stacked in perfect towers. The image wakes me sweating in the middle of the night. My friends say I was unlucky. I tell them the opposite. I was lucky the porch creaked when it did. Lucky Ramirez believed me. Lucky the man fled instead of attacking. But I also know luck is just chance in disguise. Chance put him on that land before I arrived, gave him unbarred windows, and let him blend into the forest's murmur. I gave him every advantage by choosing absolute solitude. People love to use the word remote in travel blogs, like it's a badge of bravery or authenticity. They post photos of tiny cabins under starry skies, celebrating the absence of neighbors. Those pictures rack up likes from city dwellers longing to escape. I just end up scanning the backgrounds, searching for a pale blur among the trees. I still hike, I still camp, but never alone again. And I never sleep anywhere no one could hear a scream. If that means giving up pure country silence, so be it. Because silence isn't empty. Sometimes it's full of footsteps you don't notice, until they stop right outside your door. Story 3. I've loved wild places for as long as I can remember. My earliest memory is standing on a weather-beaten porch high in the Colorado Rockies, breathing air so clean it made my lungs ache. I was 8 years old, bundled in a red parka 2 sizes too big, watching my dad unload fishing gear from the back of our old Ford Bronco. That porch belonged to a small log cabin 6 miles west of Leadville, near Turquoise Lake Road. My parents had found it through a neighbor who knew the owner, and for 3 summers in a row we drove up from Denver to spend a few August nights there. I'd wake before dawn to hear elk bugling down in the valley and fall asleep to the soft hiss of wind slipping through the scaly-barked pines. Those trips fixed the mountains inside me. Ever since, when city traffic smothers me and work emails burn holes in my screen, my mind goes back to that porch, the smell of pine resin, and the feeling that the world is still wide, empty, and good. 21 years later, I decided I needed to feel that again. I had just finished a brutal software rollout, eating takeout at my desk for weeks. My eyes burned, my head buzzed, and my Denver apartment felt like a cave full of humming appliances. I opened Airbnb, typed Leadville cabin, and there it was. The same pitched roof, the rough railings, the identical view of pine trunks dropping toward Turquoise Lake. The listing said the property had been renovated, now with solar panels and reliable Wi-Fi, but that everything else, location, porch, even the dusty gravel road, matched the photos in my childhood album. The host's profile said Heather, though the original owner's last name, Alvarez, still appeared in the description. I booked 6 nights without a second thought. On Monday, September 5th, I loaded my Subaru Outback with a week's worth of provisions, a digital SLR camera, and Porter, my elderly golden retriever mix, and took US Highway 24 west. The sky looked like a postcard, and the aspens along the Arkansas River were already hinting at gold. 90 miles later, I crested Tennessee Pass. The temperature dropped a sudden 10 degrees, and every breath tasted like cold metal. Around noon, I reached Leadville, filled the tank, and turned onto County Road 4, passing the turnoff to Sugarloaf Dam. My phone signal fell to 0 bars, just as Heather's check-in instructions warned. At last, I spotted the old mailbox painted hunter green, the number 204 still stenciled on the side. The tires crunched onto the familiar track. Porter's tail thumped against the back seat. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, timed as that. The logs darker, the porch rail smoother from years of snow and thaw. And yet everything fit, like a page I'd left unturned for 2 decades. I typed in the code Heather had sent, the lock clicked, and I stepped into a 1-room space warmed by the afternoon sun. A new cast-iron stove sat where the stone fireplace used to be, and fresh wiring hid behind pine paneling, but the knot pattern in the floorboards was the same. Porter turned twice on a rug and collapsed with a sigh. I opened all the windows to let the cabin breathe and made coffee on a small induction plate. Outside, a breeze shivered the aspens. I felt everything inside me loosen. The first 2 days passed at an easy rhythm. I got up at dawn, made strong coffee, and walked Porter down to the shore of Turquoise Lake, where the water shone like glass beneath the 10-mile range. In the mornings, I did code reviews on my laptop, napped after lunch, and at dusk, I hiked the Timberline Trail, retracing steps that had seemed gigantic when I was a kid. Every night, I sat on the porch with a headlamp and a book, listening to coyotes in the distance. I saw no hikers, no neighbors, no cars, only now and then the high blink of a plane against the stars. On the afternoon of the third day, Wednesday, September 7th, the wind shifted. Gray clouds swirled over Mount Massive, bringing an early hint of snow. I pulled on a fleece and stacked firewood beside the stove, bracing for a cold night. Around 6, the light was fading and sleep felt like pushing at the window panes. Porter lay at my feet while I answered work emails. At 6:22 p.m., according to the small digital clock on the side table, someone knocked on the door. Firm, deliberate knocks. 3. A pause, then 2 more. I froze. In 3 days, I hadn't seen anyone within half a mile. I set the laptop aside and whispered stay to Porter, though he was already upright, tail rigid. Another knock, harder. I crept to the window, careful not to show my face. A man stood on the porch, late 30s, in a tan canvas jacket darkened with damp at the shoulders. He wasn't dressed for the mountains, no hat, no gloves. If he had a truck, I couldn't see it. I cracked the door just a finger's width, enough to talk. "Can I help you?" He smiled too quickly. "Hey, don't freak out. I'm no stranger to this place," he said. "I was here last week with my girlfriend. I left something important inside. Could you let me in for a second to grab it?" The story squeaked from several angles. The listing calendar hadn't shown reservations in early September. The host lived an hour south in Buena Vista, and I remembered Heather saying fall was always booked solid for leaf season. Also, someone who truly forgot something usually names the item. He didn't. "Did you talk to Heather?" I asked. He shook his head like I was being slow. "She's not picking up." "Look, man, 30 seconds. Porter growled behind me. The man rocked back on his heels, his gaze sliding over my shoulder into the cabin. I smelled alcohol under the damp flannel. "Sorry," I said, "I can't let anyone in. Call the host and coordinate." His smile cracked. "I'm telling you I was here. That lamp." He pointed to a brass lamp on the side table. "I know every corner of this place." I closed the door a little more. "Good night." I slid the deadbolt and stepped back. His face hardened. He slapped the door with an open palm, muttered something unintelligible, and strode off the porch. I waited to hear an engine, but only sleet ticked on the roof. After a minute of silence, I exhaled, calmed Porter, and started frying dinner. 15 minutes later, a second blow made me drop the pan. This time it sounded deeper, a fist driving into the frame. Porter barked, unusual for him. Heart racing, I grabbed my phone. No signal. So I grabbed the only weapon within reach, a still-hot cast-iron skillet. I went to the peephole Heather had installed. It wasn't a visitor anymore. It was 3. The first stood to the right, shoulders hunched. Beside him, 2 guys in black hoodies and jeans, both wearing simple cloth masks. The bulk packs from hardware stores. One was pecking at the door's center panel with the tip of a large knife, scraping as if tracing invisible circles. The blade was at least 8 inches. My throat went dry. The cabin had a single entrance. The windows were old but solid, with double latches on the inside. My car keys were on the coffee table, but the Outback sat about 20 yards away, facing the opposite direction from the only passable track. Even if we reached the car, backing down that narrow road with sleet and panic would be a gamble. Hiding was worse. The cabin was one open room, no loft, no basement, All I could do was buy time and pray a car happened by, though I knew that was unlikely after dark. A muffled voice came through the door. "Open up, man. Nobody has to get hurt. We just need your help." My mouth felt full of cotton. I managed. I already called the police. It was a bluff, but maybe it would buy seconds. The man in the tan jacket laughed. "No, you didn't. There's no coverage out here. You think we don't know that?" Behind me, Porter barked again, his nails skittering on the boards. One of the hooded men kicked the door hard. The frame shuddered. I searched for something to stop them. The iron stove, a rustic chair, a half-used can of bear spray left from spring. I snatched the spray, flicked the safety off, and aimed 3 meters from the door. Bear pepper spray shoots about 25 feet in a fog and blinds on contact. My hand shook. I nearly fired too soon. Another kick splintered the lower hinge. One of them shouted, "Last chance." I squeezed the trigger. An orange cloud hissed through the gap where the latch met the frame, like a ruptured pipe. Someone on the porch swore. The door vibrated again. Then all 3 sets of footsteps scrambled off the boards. Silence. 5 seconds, 10. Then coughing, retching. "Idiot," one groaned, his voice shredded by the burn. I kept pressing until the can ran dry. The metallic click when it emptied was the most desolate sound I've ever heard. 2 endless minutes without movement. Porter whimpered against my leg. "Good boy," I whispered, eyes never leaving the door. Wind rattled the roof and shook down more sleet. Then I heard gravel crunch. An engine coughed to life and roared. Tires spit stones. Headlights swept the windows, washing the ceiling amber for a heartbeat before vanishing into the dark. The noise faded down the track. I collapsed onto the floor, arms like rubber. Porter crawled into my lap, trembling. I stroked his back, trying to breathe without gulping the pepper grit that hung in the air like hot dust. I checked the clock. 6:57 p.m. Less than 40 minutes had passed since the first knocks. The adrenaline drop hit in waves, shaking hands, buzzing ears, nausea. But I had to call for help. I draped a fleece over Porter. Sleet still fell outside. Stepping onto the porch, I nearly slipped. The spray residue had left it slick. The air reeked of Chilean chemicals. A black pickup, its plate splattered with mud, was already just a red blink in the distance. With no signal, I locked the cabin, leashed Porter, and jogged half a mile uphill to a bend on County Road 4, where an old mining museum keeps a payphone for tourists. My lungs burned in the altitude. At the top, I fed 4 coins into the slot and dialed 911. The call connected to the Lake County Sheriff's dispatch. The operator's steady voice anchored me. I gave the address, explained the attack, and described the 3 men, especially the one in the tan jacket, and the black pickup with a dented right fender. She told me to wait by the museum. The patrol cars were closer to me than to the cabin, and there I'd have electric light. 20 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies, Ruiz and Harmon, arrived. They took my statement and then escorted me back, red and blue lights painting the forest. The men were gone, of course, but evidence was everywhere. The doorframe splintered, knife marks in the wood, and bear spray staining the porch railing like orange varnish. Ruiz photographed everything and bagged a balaclava they must have dropped while fleeing. It smelled of sweat and spray. Harmon found boot prints in the mud, 3 different sizes. He measured the sole patterns with a small ruler, explaining that most cabins up there sit empty mid-week, easy targets for smash and grabs. Usually they take electronics, but sometimes they confront renters if they think they're tourists with expensive cameras. He said they might have tailed me from Leadville after seeing a car with gear. They asked for a list of what was stolen. I checked drawers and packs. To my surprise, they hadn't taken much inside, but they had gotten into my car before I locked it after the first knock. My SLR body, 2 lenses, and the laptop bag were gone. So were my wallet and a pair of wireless headphones. Ruiz whistled softly. Thieves love small electronics, easy to resell. The loss hurt, but I was still breathing and Porter's tail still moved. At 10:30 p.m., Ruiz radioed in and suggested I return to Leadville to complete the report. He didn't recommend spending the night at the cabin. I packed the essentials, grabbed Porter's bed, and locked up. In the patrol car's headlights, the porch looked eerily normal, like nothing had happened. I could almost see my 8-year-old self at the railing, dropping pine cones to the ground. I slept at a pet-friendly motel on Harrison Avenue, holding Porter like he was the last blanket in the world. I called my parents on the lobby Wi-Fi. My dad muttered a low curse. My mom cried, and both begged me to come home. I promised I would in the morning. Before dawn, Ruiz called my room. State troopers had spotted a speeding black pickup near Granite, 40 minutes south, matching the description. They tried to stop it. The driver swerved, nearly hit a fence, and continued toward Buena Vista. No plate recorded and no arrest. At daybreak, I checked out. The clerk handed me a paper bag. Inside were my wallet and the lenses. Deputies had found them dumped behind a dumpster at a gas station on the outskirts. The camera body and laptop were still missing. I thanked him, loaded Porter, and drove toward Denver, feeling lighter with each mile only because I was farther from that porch. 3 weeks later, the sheriff's office called. Officers in Salida had detained a trio burglarizing vacation homes, 2 brothers and a cousin from Pueblo. One still had cheeks burned by bear spray. In their truck, they found my SLR, the laptop, and a scratched cast-iron skillet with a chip on the rim. They also had knives, pry bars, and an unregistered firearm. The men admitted they'd knock on doors claiming they'd stayed there and force their way in if the cabin looked empty or was occupied by a single person. They hadn't expected bear spray from inside. I got my things back at the courthouse. Most of the electronics still worked, though the laptop reeked of motor oil. The sheriff shook my hand and said I'd been lucky. I nodded, but I didn't feel lucky. Only the hollow echo of that first knock. I went home, stored the gear, and set the bear spray on the same shelf as my childhood album. I haven't been back to the cabin since.